Sorry, I couldn't resist this slide. So I'm afraid we're starting with silver. So for those of you who are ceramicists, please just let it wash over you. So we wanted to start with the Queen. In 2 weeks' time, the King and Queen of Spain will be arriving at Buckingham Palace for a state visit, where they will be welcomed by an official state banquet. The banquet, which usually caters for around 160 to 190 guests, takes place in London in the ballroom of the palace or at Windsor in St George's Hall. A well-choreographed and by now well-rehearsed proceeding, the banquet incorporates many traditions from the Queen's forebears. Guests are led to their seats before Her Majesty, accompanied by the visiting head of state, processes into the ballroom, preceded by the Lord Chamberlain and the Lord Steward, each carrying his white wand of office. And traditionally, they walk backwards. Sorry, I had to include this slide partly because I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but if you look, the Lord Chamberlain and the Lord Steward with their white wands of office walking backwards in front of Queen Victoria. The table is usually dressed to its finest, laden with flowers and surrounded by buffets of plate and porcelain. The meal is served by liveried footmen and pages, and the yeomen of the guard stand on duty throughout. Music is performed by one of the guard's regiments. The entire scene is intended to be one of magnificence. Sir Roy Strong described one such event in 1976. The tables were an explosion of damask, silver-gilt, glass, and flowers. Huge silver-gilt candelabra piled high with sweet peas and roses were interspersed with smaller gold vases of flowers, all the cutlery being silver-gilt. Vast chandeliers lit the room, but what was quite extraordinary were the three great buffets, with displays of plate done in a manner Louis XIV would have recognised. Behind each ascended boards upholstered in deep crimson velvet, which were studded with huge pieces of gold plate and Baroque wall sconces. By the serving tables stood batteries of footmen. The impact on entering can only be described as dazzling. It's certainly a scene that Queen Victoria might well have recognised. The tables, the buffets, the lighting, the ceremony might all have appeared in her reign. Some elements have changed, obviously. Today, one of the three buffets, which was traditionally decked in plate, is now used to show off the Rockingham service created for William IV. The quantity and style of food has obviously changed, but the number of courses has greatly reduced, but the essentials remain. More importantly, Roy Strong recognised that the scene was one of out of an aquatant of the court of George IV. Dining may now be à la Russe and no longer à la Française. The courses may now only be limited to 4, but the bedazzled diners and references to Louis XIV could only have gladdened George IV's heart. This is largely because at the heart of the state banquet, and indeed at any large dinner reception or even garden party held at the palace, the plate on show and in use is drawn from the grand service. George IV's extraordinary table of silver, silver-gilt, and ormolu. So, if over the next 2 days we are to discuss the splendours of the dining table, it seems only right that we begin with the most theatrical, opulent, and magnificent of monarchs of the modern era, Partridge him, and with his theatrical, magnificent, and opulent dining service. The grand service is actually an amorphous concept. The term does not seem to have been used during George IV's lifetime, but appears first in 1832 in an inventory drawn up by Rundlebridge and Rundle for William IV. The title may have been chosen deliberately to equate the service with Napoleon's Grand Vermeil, the great gilded service supplied in 1804 to the emperor. The grand service does not, apparently, have many unifying features. It incorporates a vast range of styles and works by an array of artists, sculptors, and designers. Most of the elements, but not all, are gilded. The two other large dining services used by George IV were named the Crown Service and the Lion Service, after the crests that were used on most of the handles of the serving dishes and the tureens, but not so the Grand Service. If there are any unifying features, they are that the vast majority of it was supplied by Rundlebridge and Rundle, and today it finds its homogeneity in its weight, its grandeur, and its association with George IV. Later inventories have included a whole array of miscellaneous articles under the heading Grand Service, including, for example, the life-size gold tiger's head and the jewelled bird of good fortune, or Huma bird, taken from the throne of Tipu Sultan, the complex pocket knife made by Rogers and Sons of Sheffield in a plea for support from the Sheffield industries by George IV, and the Lincoln Race Cup and Goodwood Race Cup of 1829, items which George III had used aboard the royal yacht, and even a trowel used by William IV to lay the foundation stone of Hampton Church. This eclectic range mirrors the elements of the main body of the service itself, and it's not difficult to understand the cataloguer's confusion. Some or many of these pieces may have appeared on the sideboards of certain banquets. By and large, these pieces fall outside the dates of the creation of the Grand Service, but not exclusively so. So what pieces do merit the title Grand Service? The use of heavy-gauge silver and the predominance of cast elements can be said to draw the disparate elements together, but there is none of the continuity found, for example, in the elegant porcelain services of the same period. Moreover, William IV and Queen Victoria both supplemented the service during their reigns, William adding the great 5-foot-tall candelabrum featuring St. George and the Dragon, and Victoria various smaller articles such as dessert stands and iced water jugs. In this respect, it is, for the curator, a rather slippery fish to capture. The first mention of the service is found in 1806, when Joseph Farrington noted in his diary on the 3rd of May, "The Prince has also ordered plate from Rundle's to the amount of £70,000, among which are articles which can never be required to be used." This prodigiously large order appears in Rundle's document simply as a list of articles preparing, and the first delivery was made to the Prince Regent in 1811, in time for the spectacular fete held in Carlton House in June to celebrate the birthday of George III. The occasion, which catered for 3,000 guests, was said to have surpassed in splendour anything of the kind that ever took place in this country. While some of my colleagues who work in the 16th century may disagree with such a statement, there is no denying that as ever, George took full advantage of the moment. As the Dowager Lady Vernon wrote to Mary Frampton, "Our Prince Regent is never so happy as in show and state, and there he shines incomparably." The table used for the dinner ran the full length of the ground floor of Carlton House. The Prince Regent himself sat at the head of the table in the Gothic-style conservatory with a 3-tier sideboard behind him, covered with crimson drapery. The Gentleman's Magazine of the year noted, "It was constructed to exhibit to the greatest effect, a profusion of the most exquisitely wrought silver-gilt plate." An illuminated GR appeared above the buffet. Famously, the entire length of the table was dressed with silver and gilt plate, nestled in banks of moss and aquatic flowers, through which a stream ran from a fountain at one end of the table, through a succession of cascades into a circular lake surrounded with architectural decorations and small vases, burning perfumes, which stood under the arches of the colonnade around the lake. Live silver and gold fish swam in the stream, and I love this caricature. John Bull in the conservatory. Even with this first large delivery from Rundle's, George was still forced to hire in much of the plate on show, and the original bill for the service also included the repair and regilding of a lot of old plate. The initial order of 1806 shows a general practical nature, serving dishes and tureens of various sizes, salts, cruets, bread baskets, candelabra, and snuffers, ice pails, verrières, and wine labels. The table plates were supplied by the 24 dozen. There were 6 dozen soup plates and 25 dozen sets of cutlery and spoons. For the dessert, there were stands, sugar vases, and salvers. There were a few ornamental pieces, perhaps those which Farrington dismissed as those items never required to be used, among them 7 for the sideboard, all of them large dishes. The dessert plate and sideboard pieces were to be gilded, the rest supplied in the white. As a small aside, it is worth noting that the silver service was gradually gilded throughout, and many of the existing bills relate as much to the return of works to Rundle's for gilding as to the supply of new pieces. There are several explanations to this. The first, of course, is that it supplies some of the otherwise missing homogeneity. The service among those supplied to George IV, is the only one to be almost entirely gilded. There must simultaneously have been some element of rivalry with Napoleon's Grand Vermeil, if the usurping emperor appeared to dine off gold plate, should the King of Great Britain not do likewise. But this may have also been the case following public opinion. George's great service was always intended to be put on display. Small Gothic niches in his dining room at Carlton House were created for the permanent display of the plate, with gilded wooden stands being supplied to place works on. This watercolour gives some idea of the displays as much as the white plate, and incidentally, what appears to be biscuit porcelain on the table. It was Mary Frampton who, in 1814, wrote of seeing the supper room, "All was in gold or silver-gilt, which made the silver plate, set out in the deep recessed windows, look cold and poor, although in reality it was very massive and handsome." Many of the elements which may be said today to characterize the service can be seen in this first delivery of 1811. Produced at a moment when the designers of the day were seeking to create a new English style, the service includes elements of the classical, both Greek and Roman, mixed with Egyptian motifs, often incorporated in a single work. Sorry about this slide. Because these objects are still in use, it's quite difficult to get hold of them for photography, so I'm afraid we're relying on some old black and whites for some of them. So, for example, these 24 candelabra from the service show a rather Thomas Hope-inspired Egyptian figures with these lovely bare feet, combined with the heavier lion's paw bases, more akin to the engravings of Piranesi. The great tureens, which are supplied in two sizes, show winged sphinxes, combined with figures of the Diana of Ephesus, with lotus leaves and serpents. In this case, the Egyptian elements strike one less as based on the archaeological traditions of Thomas Hope and more on the strong element of French design from Percier and Fontaine's 1801 publications of interior decorations and Denon's 1802 account of the voyage into Egypt. At the same time, the Diana of Ephesus is drawn straight from excavations and the related prints circulated in the 18th century. Some of the works in the service are more straightforwardly drawn from antique precedents, such as the Medici and Warwick vase wine coolers, largely known from the Piranesi engravings, and a set of sugar vases also drawn from Piranesi's works. Simultaneously, Thomas Stothard was producing a modern take on the Neoclassical with his boys with tigers, as they were usually described, which appear on the flatware, wine labels, decanter stands, and trays. And as you can see here, the design for the tray remains in the Royal Library. There is some possibility that Sir Francis Chantry was involved in some of the modelling of these pieces. At the same moment, John Flaxman was producing designs for these verrières, decorated with figures of Hebe and the eagle, an appropriate subject for a cup-bearing vessel, and created in Flaxman's best linear style, possibly based on this relief, which is now in the Hermitage Museum, but in the 18th century was in a collection in Venice. Meanwhile, a set of source tureens described as richly ornamental with oak and vine leaves in high relief show little of the French or classical influence produced by Benjamin Smith at Rundle's Greenwich workshops. These originally had oak leaf handles. There is some evidence that the oak leaf motif appeared more frequently after the Battle of Trafalgar, and here where they celebrating the popular Hearts of Oak song in reference to the Great British Navy. And it was much celebrated. Indeed, they became one of the major national motifs. In addition, these tureens show something of the taste for decorated surface with little unadorned silver on display. The fluting, combined with swags of oak and vine, and the serpent handles and other features all suggest a drive to what has been described as the Regency taste for restless energy in the design. This move sits alongside the emerging taste for the Rococo revival works, characterized especially at Rundle's by exuberant naturalism, Elements of this emerge especially in the dessert stands, largely commissioned after 1811. For example, the stands created between 1812 and 21 with small classical figures of boys around the base, which incorporate convolvulus branches of the most naturalistic type. They don't appear to have any discernible purpose, the bowls being very small, and the branches are actually very fragile and springy, and I don't think they would have borne much weight. Similarly, these stands of 1813 to 18 incorporate figures designed by John Flaxman, possibly the Three Graces, who dance in a whirl around a typically Flaxmanesque vase-shaped stem. But above them sit tiers of leaves from a pineapple with their carefully serrated edges, and the bills describe them as to receive pineapples. The ultimate Rococo revival works must be these tureens, created, as the bill notes, made from the pattern of the Duke of Orleans. The similarities with the oak and vine leaf sauce tureens are clear, but to these have been added a typically Rococo crest of vegetables, mushrooms, and crayfish. The stand, however, leaves one in no doubt of the Regency date of these works. Heavy in style and casting, it nevertheless incorporates stalks of celery and further vegetables, which appear as if tumbled from the cover above. Interestingly, these tureens are marked 1812-13, but were actually only acquired by George in 1826, when he was also charged for the creation of armorials to be added to them. This would suggest that the works had a previous owner before they were sold on to the king. So at this moment, I would like to take a brief detour. While Rundles called George IV their greatest patron and best friend, they did not reserve any of the designs created for the king as exclusively his, nor indeed was he necessarily the first client to receive one of their new designs. I don't think that the relationship between John Bridge and George IV can be overstated in any way. Bridge made, at many points in their history, daily visits to the prince and later king to offer up new designs, proffer new ideas, or simply have discussions with his patron. Their relationship was clearly one beyond patron and client. I have come across only one piece in all the bills and ledgers relating to Rundles that was returned to the shop as not approved of, which is extraordinary, given the quantity of material that he acquired. Bridge especially seems to have understood his client's taste and catered accordingly. Thus, I would argue that the firm was the first to be able to overturn the relationship between royal patron and supplier. It was the firm of Rundle and Bridge which drove George's taste rather than the other way round. George's reliance on Bridge is made clear from a recently discovered document, which some of you may have seen. It was packed into the back of a print of George Heriot, the jeweller to James I. The document, closely written in John Bridge's hand, explains that the print was a personal gift from George IV in return for his work on the coronation regalia, and is followed by the story of the king's insistence that Bridge attend the coronation with a free pass to all areas of the abbey, despite protests that this went entirely against protocol. Bridge suggests that the king wanted him there in case the newly made items of jewellery for the coronation might need adjustment. But it must equally have been the case that the beleaguered George, in the throes of the controversy surrounding Queen Caroline and the anxieties of the coronation, must have been in need of an ally. But to return to the service. The most wonderfully eclectic mix of all the styles we have so far seen may be found in these tureens from the service, primarily Rococo in taste. The bowls are formed as giant clamshells, surmounted by trophies of writhing eels, crayfish, and vegetable fronds. However, the trumpeting tritons are pure Bernini of the highest Baroque form, copying those found on the Fontana del Tritone in the Piazza Barberini in Rome. The hippocamps, which support the shells, meanwhile, may have been inspired by the Kunstkammer works of the 16th and 17th century held in George's collection. Again, on an organic Rococo base of sea foam and waves. It is another of the strands that characterize the grand service. Much of it has a marine flavor, tritons, hippocamps, shells, coral, and turtles prevailing. Of course, marine themes were often produced at this period, the moment of celebration in the wake of the Battle of Trafalgar. Moreover, George's favourite dish was turtle soup, and the marine elements may well have been a celebration of this. However, in part at least, the preponderance of sea motifs must have been inspired by the service belonging to George's grandfather, Frederick, Prince of Wales, a small but highly significant service created by Nicholas Spremont in 1741-3, and at least in part marked by Paul Crespin, which at its heart has the Neptune centerpiece, the high point of Rococo design in Frederick's collection. It's accompanied by the famous crab and crayfish salts, which I'm sure you all know from a subsequent recreation in porcelain at the Chelsea factory, and by 2 pairs of sauce boats with Triton and Naiad handles. Indeed, this service appears to have been so inspirational to George that he commissioned a later base to the centerpiece to build it up to a suitably Regency scale, incorporating large cast hippocamps and marine trophies. I don't wish to imply by this that the subsequent additions to the grand service change from classical and Egyptian to Rococo and other styles. These different designs appear from the first, and they seem to have been intermingled and continue to be used throughout the years of the Regency and the reign of George IV. After the initial order, regular new commissions were placed with Rundles over the subsequent 1820 years, the final order being received in 1829. In some cases, this was simply a case of ordering greater numbers of a single object, the quantity of salts, for example, growing from 2 to 3 dozen in several cases. More often, it was simply a case of seeking new and varied designs. There are some chronological variations, however. Nothing that might be described as Gothic appears on the table before George IV's accession and subsequent reshaping of the castle at Windsor. This, despite the fact that the great glory of Carlton House, as we've seen with the conservatory, was used for dining and was created in the incredibly Gothic architectural style. However, the Gothic does not appear to have crept much into the vocabulary of Rundles at all. That being said, among the earliest items delivered from Rundles was a plateau mounted with figures of the Black Prince, the most admired of the Prince of Wales's predecessors, and held up as the great English exemplar of chivalry, courage, and patriotism in the 18th century, and whose image appeared again and again in the decorative schemes at Windsor in the earlier period. Of the grand service, this is one of the few pieces which does not survive. And although there are a number of mirrored plateaux in existence, we can only gain some vague insight into how this piece must have appeared. If there was any Gothic to it, it is to be assumed that at this early date of 1811, it was of the softest and most romantic kind. The more studied, accurately named Gothic does not appear at all in Rundle's work until the adoption of the young prodigal, Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, in the 1820s. Little of Pugin's fervour for Gothic ecclesiastical architecture, however, made its way onto George's table and was largely reserved for his chapel plate. There are a few hints, however. Sorry, this is a terrible photograph, but it was the best I could do. This is a set of 24 goblets produced in the late 1820s, and as you can see, they have these rather beautiful ivy stalk stems and these wonderfully gnarly roots around the feet. And you can clearly see, I think, the influence of the work of Dürer on these designs. It's likely these goblets, although grouped under the category of the grand service, were actually supplied for the Garter Knights, and thus the medieval foundation of the order is celebrated in the form and decoration of the cup. Simultaneously with these being produced, the final and greatest object, suspense, there we are, to be included in the service was Stothard's great wine cooler. It looks, of course, back to his earlier boys and tigers designs created in the first decade of the century. The wine cooler remains the largest piece of wrought English silver in existence, weighing some 8,000 troy ounces, and is traditionally on display at the Tower. I'm sure you've all seen it, largely because its size makes it almost impossible for us to display it anywhere else. As you may know, it was turned by Queen Victoria into a great punch bowl with the addition of an enormous ladle, and was used at royal christenings. Not, I should say, for dunking the baby in. Its origins in the grand service, however, are clear. The predominance of cast decoration, the neo-Rococo naturalistic rockwork and shells, the mythological subjects, and the work's sheer monumental scale and grandeur. It was not, sadly, completed during George's lifetime, but was delivered to William IV and first used at his 65th birthday celebration at Windsor Castle in 1830. According to legend, John Bridge was keen to see the work in use and attended the dinner himself. But because of his notoriously shy nature, he chose to hide behind the wine cooler during the evening. And for the practically minded among you, I should point out that it is actually on casters, so it doesn't have to be carried around. It was not unknown for objects in the service to be returned to the workshops to be refashioned as new pieces. Thus, for example, a table ornament originally created in 1811 was described in the lists as a superb ornament piece of plate to receive a dish or basket for the sideboard or centre of the table, composed of 4 griffins, winged, on a richly chased base with lamp in centre. In 1818, this single piece was sent to Rundle's for recreation. The 4 griffin figures were divided into 2 pairs and converted into these candelabra. In 1820, they returned again to have base plates added to the plinths, engraved with the royal coat of arms in reverse, so that when they were placed on the mirrored plateau in the centre of the table, the arms would read correctly. Similarly, these phoenix ornaments were originally supplied on fluted pedestals, but again, within 5 years, the pedestals had been removed and adapted to support vases, and the phoenixes were given these extraordinary rockwork bases instead. It's not clear whether it was at this stage or later that small naphtha burners were inserted into the works, and they're now between the wings of the phoenixes. But certainly they were there by 1832, and at that point they're described as lamps. The availability to the designers working for Rundle's on second-hand plate or old pieces sent in for boiling or repair inspired several new works for the grand service. So at the same time as Flaxman's set of verrières with the figure of Hebe, which I showed earlier, this set of verrières of an entirely different design were created. They're probably inspired by 16th century turned wooden mazer bowls. They were supplied in 1827 at the surprisingly large cost of £1,211 and 10 shillings. Similarly, these dishes of a completely outmoded form for the early 19th century were supplied as a set of 8 in 1812 and marked by William Pitts, with a further 4 being supplied by Bridge in 1828. As you can see, they mirror almost exactly a pair which were created for Frederick, Prince of Wales by George Wicks in 1744. So then, what we have is an eclectic range of styles, apparently all functioning together on the same table. What is perhaps more remarkable is the range of designers at Rundle's fingertips who were brought in to work on the various works in the service. We have already mentioned Thomas Stothard, artist and engraver, whose output is calculated to encompass around 5,000 designs for bookplates, architectural features, and illuminations, as well as for the items of plate. Stothard was involved in the renovation of Buckingham House during Nash's tenure as architect of the new Buckingham Palace. And you can see here he was responsible for a number of the rather playful friezes incorporating butterflies and putti, for example. He may also have designed a ticket for George IV's coronation. John Flaxman's contribution as a designer for Rundle's are well recorded, but especially the drawn-out process of designing the famous Shield of Achilles, which Philip Rundle found so painful when Flaxman insisted on reading the entire description in Greek to him. It was Flaxman who was responsible for the 2 great highlights of the grand service, the candelabra, which stand at 4 feet tall, one representing the serpent Ladon, being fed by the 3 daughters of Night, while he guards the golden apples of the Hesperides, and the other showing Mercury delivering the infant Bacchus to the care of the nymphs of Nysa. In fact, these monumental works are another example of George's change of heart during their lifetime. They were originally created as shorter centerpieces topped by a single tier of candle branches, and described simply as superb ornaments for the centre of the table. They were almost certainly modelled by William Theed. The upper sculptural stems and tier of branches were designed by Flaxman around 1815. I hope you can see they were worked up to their final practical working state over the following 2 years. As you can see from the surviving designs, Flaxman was working purely as a sculptor. The details of the candle branches, for example, are left barely sketched in, and it usually fell to Edward Hodges Bailey to add the practical elements, working Flaxman's drawings into 3D designs that the craftsman in usually Paul Storr's workshop could adopt. Bailey himself may also have designed a number of works in the service. An existing album of drawings in the V&A is attributed largely to his hand, although how many of these works were his own is difficult to determine. William Theed was also a prolific contributor to Rundle's design shop. It was Theed who created the tritons with shells, which appear frequently as motifs in the service, as salts and dessert stands, but also as a great bronze which was acquired by George IV after its display at the Royal Academy, and again in the friezes of Buckingham Palace. It is clear, therefore, that Rundles were able to draw on the most significant pool of talent in the creation of the Grand Service, sculptors and draftsmen who were otherwise working on the great national monuments of the day. In fact, I'm going to go so far as to suggest that the Grand Service itself, if it can be termed as anything, might be considered a national monument. It is essentially a series of great sculptural works, each individually weighty and monumental. It celebrates British naval power and suggests links back to the great Roman emperors, the great civilizations of Egypt and Greece. It draws out the romance of medieval history and the romance of royal history. And en masse, the Grand Service supplies a magnificent, gilded and celebratory backdrop to the ceremonial work of the monarchy. Thank you.